Good evening, I'm Phil Donahue.
And I'm Vladimir Posner.
And we are pleased to welcome you to this edition of Posner and Donahue on CNBC, where we have Vladimir as our guest. If there is an intellectual walking around today, and we might wonder and have some doubts about that, this is most certainly that person. Embarrassed as he might be about his media constantly referring to him as arguably the most important intellectual today, Noam Chomsky, nevertheless, has got to grin and bear the insistence on media's insistence on calling him, perhaps on occasion, the smartest man on earth. Well, he is the tenured professor of linguistics at MIT. He is one of the world's leading social critics. And do I understand that you have some information suggesting that he's also in the column with Marx?
Well, yes. According to what we've read, he is among the 8 most quoted thinkers ever, including people like Aristotle and Plato and what have you.
I'm the 9th, incidentally.
Well, I'm the 10th. Actually, the number 1, believe it or not, is Marx, and the number 2 is Lenin. But I think the reason for that is that in the old days in the Soviet Union, they were quoted in every newspaper every day. So if you count up all those quotes, that puts them way ahead. But seriously speaking, yes, that's what we've learned, that actually Noam Chomsky is number 8 in that staggering list of people.
Well, we want to talk about Professor Chomsky, sir. We want to talk about a full-length documentary playing in the on the big screen in selected theaters around the country and
around the world.
And around the world, Canada, to be sure, which is titled Manufacturing Consent. And we will talk about that. May I ask you to bear up or be patient with our interest in soliciting from you your commentary on some very important contemporary events. Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia. What might Professor Chomsky want to share with us about this agony today and the United States' responsibility about it?
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think that's been primarily a U.S. responsibility. It's been tragic the way it's been handled. The situation has reached a point where it's not easy to think of a constructive solution anymore. A few years ago, there were options. At this point, I think the way in which the Yugoslavian breakup was handled was almost guaranteed to lead to extreme conflict. I think that's primarily a European responsibility in this case. Germany insisted on a very rapid breakup without any preparation. In fact, insisted that they were going to go through it alone, which means Europe has to go along. If Europe didn't agree and the rest of the world didn't agree,
by recognizing the independence of the different...
Yeah, I mean, Slovenia was pretty straightforward. I mean, that just pulled out, became independent, no great strife. The insistence on Croatian independence, however, was done without recognition of the fact that there's a substantial Serbian minority, and that was a guarantee of war, you know. I mean, and in fact, then there was a bitter war. Bosnia was recognized without any preparation, again, big Serbian minority and Croatian minority, and the spillover from the Serbian-Croatian war, you know, immediately brought them into it, and it was just done in such a fashion as to maximize everything going wrong, and it did go wrong. Now, at this point, when you ask for constructive proposals at this point, it's pretty hard to suggest them. I mean, there are things one, you know, I think there probably are palliatives, and one can imagine improvements, but a substantial to deal with the problem in a really constructive fashion is not easy. I don't think. Yeah. I've yet to hear a serious proposal.
Would you agree with the view that that seems to be pretty much predominant in world media today, that it's really the Serbs who are the killers, the rapists, the murderers, and so on?
Well, you know, in these conflicts, the ones who commit most of the atrocities are the ones who have most of the guns. And in fact, they have most of the guns, yes, so they're committing most of the atrocities. I mean, it's not that they have different genes or anything like that.
No. I am struck by your humble confession here, or statement of helplessness. It comes from one of the most millions feel, courageous social critics of our time. You almost went to jail in your protests of the Vietnam War. You have been thunderous in your denunciation of United States foreign policy in Central America and elsewhere. You are the person who has reminded us most often of the probability of power and violence expressed by just about all governments. And here you are saying, boy, I don't know what to do in Bosnia.
As I say, there were things that could have been done,
right,
but they weren't done.
But what does your
now? What do we do
tell you
now?
We have babies being
right.
slaughtered.
Well, I think there are, as I say, there are probably palliatives. For example, I think the embargo on Bosnia, arms embargo, should have been lifted a long time ago. It's in effect a unilateral embargo.
In other words, let them feed the children. Is that your point?
No,
let them have arms.
Let the Muslim community have arms.
There's an arms embargo, which in effect is unilaterally on Bosnia, because that's the only, no one else is paying any attention.
So just hand out the guns and let them shoot each other.
No, I think there's more than that. I mean, I think it should be possible. I mean, there are technical problems that one shouldn't underestimate. Yeah. And you have to know the topography, and you have to know where who's going to shoot from which direction, and so on. But it's hard to imagine that there isn't a way to, with a show of force and maybe even a threat of possibly even use of force, to at least improve delivery of humanitarian aid and to silence the guns shelling Sarajevo. Now, we shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of that. That's a technical problem. You have to know how to do that, You can't just say, well, let's send out the planes and do it. But I imagine that would be possible. On the other hand, if you talk about serious intervention, chances are it would cause a lot more problems than it would. It could have quite unpredictable consequences. So, say, take the possible reaction inside Russia. I mean, it's no big secret that there's an old tradition you can read in Tolstoy's novels, about we got to save the Serbs, to save the Serbs from the Turks or whatever.
Turks, right.
That's an old tradition in Russia. There's a lot of concern in especially nationalist circles and military circles in Russia about the breakup of the system, the humiliation, and so on. It's entirely possible that, in fact, there already are Russian so-called volunteers fighting with the Serbs.
You say so-called, you don't think they're really volunteers? I think they are.
Maybe they are.
I think there are. Not a few Russians who are happy to fight on the Serb side.
But suppose that the segments of the military really become involved. Suppose they go down there with, tactical nuclear weapons on their backs, which you can think of a lot of ugly possibilities. And those, or suppose that some sort of international intervention would stimulate the Serbs to carry out the kind of desperate and violent acts that are not uncommon in small states or communities that feel themselves embattled. For example, they might decide to move on Kosovo, bringing in the Turks, in fact, which is not impossible. You could have a Balkan War. Now, all of these are possible consequences of direct intervention, and not to be treated lightly.
We are in we are in Fort Lee, New Jersey, with Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT, and we'll be back in just a moment. Yes, I just expected a man of your tradition to have something to call for a moral response. You are a philosopher. You make the point that we have a responsibility to shape a moral conscience and take courageous stands. So just for the sake of the slow learners, myself included, the difference, this is ethnic cleansing. These are premeditated killings based upon the ethnicity of the person on the other end of the rifle, including women and children and old people. The difference between this and what Hitler did is what? The difference between what's happening in Bosnia and what...
It's not... what Hitler did was try to carry out total extermination and, in fact, succeed with the Jews and the Gypsies. They're trying to drive them out and kill the ones who won't stay. And there's plenty of examples of that in the world, plenty of examples. In 1948 in Palestine, there were similar examples. It's ugly. It's extremely ugly, and what's going on there is very ugly. When you talk about a moral response, you're correct. However, we have to think what a moral response is. An action is you're a moral agent. You're carrying out, you're thinking in moral terms. if you ask, what are the human consequences of the actions that I propose?
Why would that not have been an appropriate question for the Allies to ask in following the invasion of Poland by Hitler?
Well, first of all, following the invasion of Poland, there was, what happened, in fact, after the invasion of Poland is that Britain and France declared war. But at that time, remember, Hitler was not carrying out an extermination policy. And very few people assumed that he would be.
Well, then they had less evidence then to send their loved ones to spill blood in behalf of this.
But they did. France and England declared war honoring a treaty that they had with Poland. And then they sat there and
they
didn't do
didn't
anything.
fight. You know that.
I'm trying to understand the moral distinction.
First of all, during the Second World War, there were no moral actions. No one entered into any actions for moral grounds. And in fact, states are not moral agents. They don't act with moral goals. Humans do, but not states.
Okay.
Now, if we want to, we can pressure our states to. States are instruments of violence. People are moral agents. They can press their state, especially in democratic states, with some effectiveness sometimes, to either mute their violence or to carry out, even relatively benign actions. But you have to ask yourself, what actions am I proposing? Now, if you do want to think in moral terms, you say, what are going to be the human consequences of the actions I'm proposing?
I am asking you.
There's nothing moral about condemning atrocities. That's trivial. You can condemn the atrocities of Genghis Khan, but you can't do anything about it.
Right, but I'm still somewhat confused as to why the questions that you pose, which no doubt honorable people could ask, many did, in advance of our participation in World War II, would come up with a yes, we are morally obliged to commit our own blood and our loved ones to the arresting of the Nazi menace.
We did nothing of the sort. Germany declared war on us.
We didn't declare war on Germany. That's true. It was
Germany declared war on us.
It was never a moral issue.
Germany declared war on us.
Well, and the Russians didn't fight the Germans because of a moral issue.
These are all.
But all right, Germany declared war on us, but they were just as geographically distant from us to give us at least the option to make these judgments about whether or not we want to send our.
But we did not enter the Second World War in order to stop Germany.
All right, so the difference.
Look at this. We have a record of this. I mean, up until the late 1930s, the State Department was saying we have to support Hitler because he's a moderate who's standing between the extremes of left and right.
To be sure. So if Milosevic declares war on us, then...
No, look, if you're suggesting that we should go to war against Serbia...
I'm not. I'm trying to figure out what's the difference. And you're telling me
between what and what?
The difference between our commitment, which I'm sure you support, in fighting Hitler...
We fought... Now, first of all, the war against Hitler we fought because a U.S. military base in a colony was attacked by Japan. That's how we got into.
Well, the Muslims in Bosnia should hope for some kind of.
Now look, going to war against.
I beg your pardon. You're used to this. This is called media, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Well, that's all. No.
Well, I am instructed by your review of 20th century history. I also accept your commentary that these issues are complex. But if you're going to argue that the complexity of the circumstances in the former Yugoslavia at this moment give you the ability to, in good conscience, essentially pray for God's blessing here and hope that something good happens, then you can't really consistently condemn other people who might likewise bring, for example, their own hesitation, as many did in the 30s, about whether America firsters, Charles Lindbergh, Joseph P. Kennedy, the former ambassador to the Court of St. James. All, you can't stand on a high moral mountain and suggest that somehow shame should come down to them because they are likewise hand-wringing because of the complexity that existed prior to American involvement in World War II.
Well, I'm sorry, but no one proposed going to war against Hitler. No one in high places. And in fact, the State Department, right up until 1937, was saying, yeah, we got to support Hitler as the moderate. I mean, we can talk, talk about what should have happened, but let's separate it from what did happen.
All right.
Now, in this case, or in the case of Hitler, or in much more crucial cases, like the case of Vietnam or Central America, much more crucial because we could do something about it. What you ask is, are there policies that I can, in conscience, recommend because of their likely beneficial human consequences? That's what a moral person does if he's going to be consistent. Now, in the case of, say, Vietnam, in the case of atrocities carried out by our own state or client states, there are almost always things to do straight off. In the case of atrocities carried out by some enemy state or some, let's say Sri Lanka, some place that we just have no serious connection with, very often there just isn't a lot that you can do. You can pontificate about it, but you can't suggest things that will help. Now, in the case of Yugoslavia, what you have to ask, if you care about the people, if you care about the human beings, not your own, sort of preening your feathers, then you ask, what are the likely human consequences, say, for the people of Yugoslavia or the region, if we do X?
Right.
And you have to ask, well, what are those consequences? So let's say, suppose somebody proposes an American invasion of Serbia, okay? Then we ask, well, what are the likely consequences? Or let's say a UN invasion.
Yeah.
Then we say, well, what are the likely consequences? Well, I mentioned some of the possible ones, and they're not very pretty. In fact, they might end up, and are likely to end up, harming the people much more. So, therefore, if you want, you can pontificate. You can say, look, what a great moral figure I am. I think we should do X, Y, and Z. But that's not being a moral human being. A moral human being is someone who's, what are the consequences of what I'm recommending?
Mm-hmm. So you separate yourself from, for example, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times.
Well, if he had a proposal, I would be
he wants
interested.
to, among other things, provide helicopter air-to-surface artillery against gun emplacements surrounding Sarajevo.
He wants to provide arms to the Bosnians, I believe.
Well, I think allowing them
You've
to get
already
arms,
given the green light to that, I'm understanding.
I mean, I think that's a plausible proposal.
Right.
Whether helicopter gunships could silence the guns is something that Anthony Lewis doesn't know and that I don't know. And you have to find that out before you make the proposal. See, it's all very well to say, well, let's call in helicopter gunships to stop the guns. Will it do it? Well, I don't know, and he doesn't know.
Or will it escalate it to the next level?
In fact, is it even technically possible?
I mean, there are...
He doesn't know, and I don't know.
If they shoot down the gun,
Yeah.
the helicopters, then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Come out with...
Or suppose that does incite a segments of the Russian military to simply move down there in force. Is that what you want?
Well, if I were shepherding my grandchild across an open area of downtown Sarajevo where all the trees have been chopped down so that my loved ones can have some heat at night, and bullets are whizzing by me and other mortar shells being launched at me, a civilian, and my child from a hill in Sarajevo, I'd be a little impatient at the propensity on the part of otherwise very leading, courageous social critics to sit around and wonder what the consequences of this will be.
Really?
If we sat around and wondered what the consequences would be,
Really?
For example, well, you're going to take...
I mean, suppose that, first of all, the people in Sarajevo are not calling for armed intervention. Secondly, suppose that they think it through, it's not very hard to think, and say, well, there are missiles being shot at me. Well, the answer is they wouldn't. And we have to ask whether the actions that are sometimes mindlessly being proposed might have that consequence.
Well, I do thank you for your patience in my effort to explore...
I think it's worthwhile exploring.
Well,
it is not. We always tend to go for the easy answers. Let's bomb them. Let's nuke them. Let's get them.
I know that.
You know.
And if we want to do the Washington and stop lots of atrocities...
Well, sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're in the... with 20 seconds. Well, we won't start this new subject. We should tell you once again that Manufacturing Consent is the title of a full-length documentary on the work of Noam Chomsky, who, yes, does speak as one of the world's leading social critics. We'll be back in just a moment.
You know, our
Manufacturing Consent, which incidentally was co-produced with the oversight and cooperation, and I presume funding of the Canada's Film Board, the Film Board of Canada.
National Film Board or something like that.
So Canadians, public funds of Canada went to help support the people who worked so very hard in the construction of this. Wow.
They're Canadian producers, of course.
Yes. All right. We presume there were no corporate American money that went to fund this.
I have to ask them.
Professor Chomsky was introduced, I forget where, Cambridge somewhere, I'm not sure. I mean, as the introducer quoted the New York Times as referring to Professor Chomsky as arguably the most important intellectual
in the world.
In the world.
Yes.
To which Professor Chomsky responded.
The line about the arguably the most important intellectual in the world and so on comes from a publisher's blurb, and you also always got to watch those things, because if you go back to the original, you'll find that that sentence is actually there. This is in the New York Times. But the next sentence is, since that's the case, how can he write such terrible things about American foreign policy? And they never quote that point. But in fact, if it wasn't for that second sentence, I would begin to think that I'm doing something wrong. And I'm not joking about that. It's true that the emperor doesn't have any clothes, but the emperor doesn't like to be told it. And the emperor's lapdogs, like the New York Times, are not going to enjoy the experience if you do.
I have to ask you something. For many years in the Soviet Union, that expression, lapdog, wasn't the emperor's lapdog, it was the imperious lapdog, the lapdog of whatever.
To whom were they referring?
To bourgeois newspapers, which would of course include the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the others. It kind of jars me to hear that same terminology used by a man like yourself. Now, you obviously you think about what you're saying. Would you care to qualify that when you call the New York Times a lapdog of the emperor who had no
Well, for example, as I would not compare the New York Times to the party hacks who wrote for Pravda, certainly for various reasons. For one thing, it's more diverse and it's more independent, and it's certainly not under anything like the same government pressure. On the other hand, if you look at the output, there are often remarkable similarities. And in fact, one of the differences between totalitarian states and free societies is that in totalitarian states, when the commissar class, shines the shoes of the people in power, they can at least plead fear. They can say, look, I'm afraid, I can't do anything else. In free societies, you can't plead fear, you can only plead cowardice. That's a difference too.
Go ahead. Well, let me just, in the Soviet Union, the media were controlled. And we all knew it. There was a department in the Central Committee of the Communist Party called the Department of Agitation Propaganda, later just a propaganda department, and you got your orders. This is what you're going to say about this. How you say it is your business, but this is the line. And every single publication in the country, every single television, every single radio, they followed this line. They were all controlled. But the way you tend to portray the press in this country, at least the mainstream press, seems to be pretty similar. It looks like they're all doing the same thing, and they're all controlled some way.
They have to distinguish this.
All right.
In fact, they're all doing the same thing pretty much, but they're not controlled the same way. There are many different mechanisms that can lead to similar consequences. First of all, again, let me stress the consequences aren't identical. The variety in the United States is considerably greater, and the independence is certainly greater. The mechanisms of control are totally different. The mechanisms of control, if you want to call it that, in the United States are a kind of guided free market. People they're responding to pressures that have to do with concentration of power and concentration of resources and need for advancement and so on and so forth. And you can spell these things out, they're not very subtle. But what's interesting is the uniformity of the consequence. So you say that let's take two invasions, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and the American invasion of South Vietnam. Now, in the Soviet Union, incidentally, it was recognized as a Russian invasion of Afghanistan, even in the press, but it was defended because you had to go into Afghanistan.
Never used as the word invasion was never used.
Well, actually, there was one famous initially, but by the early 80s it was already being used. In fact, there was a famous, Now, so a couple of years, within a few years, it was being used. However, the line that was coming down from the Agitprop Bureau is it's a defense of Afghanistan against terrorists supported by the CIA and the imperialists.
You were asked to come in and help. There's a limited force.
Now, let's take the United States. The United States invaded South Vietnam, attacked South Vietnam certainly no later than 1962. That's when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnamese villages, authorized the use of napalm, sent American forces into combat situations and so on. That's an invasion, okay? Then the invasion built up into a huge attack on all of Indochina. All right, that's now, what, 31 years? I'm waiting to find some phrase, one phrase in the American press, one, no, I'm not asking for a lot, one phrase in the whole mainstream press that refers to such an event as the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam. I can't find it. What you find is, uniformly, the American defense of South Vietnam, maybe unwise, against terrorists supported from the outside. Word-by-word paraphrase of what the Agitprop Bureau told them. Now, nobody told them that in the United States. Like, they didn't get an order from the government saying that's the way you got to describe it. But nevertheless, that's what the output is. You take a look. I mean, you mentioned Anthony Lewis before. He was a critic of the war by 1969 or so.
And he never called it an invasion?
No, he said that the United States, in 1969, a year after Wall Street turned against the war and told Johnson to cut it off, Anthony Lewis was writing about how the war began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it had turned into a disaster, mainly for us. Well, you know, I mean, I'm sure there were people in the Politburo who were saying that after a couple of years. Started out with blundering efforts to do good in Afghanistan, but within a few years we saw it was a disaster. I mean, it wouldn't have been a difficult thing for someone to write in Pravda by, you know, 1984, say. Now, we're talking...
by 1985.
Okay, easier by 85 after Gorbachev came in, sure.
Yes.
But, so, now here the mechanisms are radically different. And so I only mention Anthony Lewis because you mentioned him. And scholarship was the same. So, for example, in the academic world, it would have been hard to find someone more critical of U.S. policy in Asia than John King Fairbanks, the dean of American Asian scholars. He was considered virtually a communist, you know. Well, he was president of the American Historical Association in 1968, and in December he gave his presidential address, which of course was partly about Vietnam, and he said that we got into Vietnam in an excess of benevolence and disinterested kindness or something like that. But we misunderstood the relation to China, and it was sort of analytical error. The American business community had turned against the war. What about in the years up to that, there was just support for it.
But these are not people speaking because they've been told to say
absolutely.
it. They believe it.
Exactly. So
Well,
I'm saying
important.
the mechanisms are totally different.
Right.
It's the output that is astonishingly similar. Now, what are the mechanisms? Well, then you want to look at them.
Well, let's give you a chance to... the mechanisms might include General Electric.
Yeah.
The multinational corporation that owns the cable channel on which Professor Chomsky shares his views with us today. We presume that our program will make it to the airwaves without censorship.
And hopefully we will be back.
And we'll be back in just a moment. Well, one more time, Professor Chomsky, and you are, as I've reviewed not only the documentary, which shows you speaking around the world and talking to just about, seemed to me, every reporter in the northern and the southern hemisphere, you're remarkably patient with these similar questions. One more time for the highly regarded Posner and Donahue program. Here you are, the highlight of your career as a communicator on our program. America gets... mainstream media gives essentially the same message because why?
Why the same?
Yeah.
Well, we have to look what the message is. First of all, the message is one of remarkable subordination to power. Now, power in the United States doesn't happen to be in the state. It's not a centralized military bureaucratic state like in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Power in the United States primarily lies in corporations, in the corporate world. There's very narrow concentration of control over resources, over investment decisions, and so on and so forth. And that affects everything. It can't help affecting everything. It affects the government because this means that there's a very close link between governmental power and corporate power. Furthermore, just the ability to make investment decisions and financial decisions places bounds on what any government could do.
Yes.
Furthermore, now let's go to the major media. What are the major media? Well, they're huge corporations. Okay, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, they first of all are large corporations, quite profitable ones, in fact. Secondly, they're parts of even bigger conglomerates, like, you know, Westinghouse and GE and so on. Now, like any corporation, they sell a product on a market. This is a market, roughly a market, a kind of a state-guided market society. What's the product and what's the market? Well, the market's advertisers. that is other businesses. So they're selling a product to other businesses. Corporations are selling a product to other businesses. What's the product? Well, the product is audiences. Now, for the major media, the ones that kind of set the agenda, they're selling elite audiences, privileged audiences. The New York Times, say, is targeting privileged elite sectors of the population. That's their audience, and they're trying to sell that audience to other businesses. Now, so we have to begin with, just on the most elementary grounds, we look at a system. Suppose we're Martians. We're looking at this system. We say, okay, here are huge corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what picture of the world do you expect to come out of that? Then we begin to add other factors. If let's say you're the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, or a pundit on the op-ed page, and you want to really have important insights into the government. Well, we all know how that's done. You have lunch with the Secretary of State. He tells you the lies that he wants to appear tomorrow. You write them and you say, a high source in Washington. My intrepid reporting has discovered that a high source in Washington said so-and-so. In fact, if you compare the internal declassified record, of, say, people like Dean Acheson's decisions, and you look at, say, James Reston's columns, they're pretty close. And the same will be true about James Baker and Thomas Friedman. And furthermore, this is an open secret. We know that this is the way. It's not a big secret in the journalistic profession that this is. Now, in order to maintain those contacts, you better present the world a certain way, or those contacts are going to be cut off. You'll lose your opportunity to have to appear, to have special insight, to have leaks, to be able to come across with a story, a couple hours before the next person, and so on. Plus, now, in order, there's an interplay here which requires power in order to maintain your own power. That's another factor over and above the just structural and institutional properties.
Go along, you get along. But to those wounded mainstream people, Jeff Greenfield of ABC News said you were from Neptune. You're a wacko.
Not only that, but the majority of people in the Soviet Union by the late 1980s, in fact before that, would say to you, well, we know that these papers are controlled.
Absolutely.
We know. Well, whereas most Americans would say to you, Professor, give me a break. This isn't true. I have a free press. I get all the information I need.
The New York...
Are Americans less intelligent?
We report on the pollution of major corporations. We report on all these things, and here you are dropping this.
And
but
think about this.
I'll give you a chance to answer. You're not...
But this is a very...
Who controls this? You're not allowed to cut us off. I want to impress Professor Chomsky. They won't cut us off if I won't let them. Watch this. You have... from the documentary Manufacturing Consent, a very protracted look at Professor Chomsky's speeches around the world, his statements, and his social criticism, comes forward now a part of an interview that Bill Moyers conducted with none other than Tom Wolfe, the author, who responds to the question that follows Professor Chomsky everywhere he goes. Variously stated, it essentially boils down to, who the hell do you think you are? Tom Wolfe.
This is the old cabal theory that somewhere there's a room with a baize-covered desk, and there are a bunch of capitalists sitting around, and they're pulling strings. These rooms don't exist. I mean, I hate to tell Noam Chomsky this. You don't share that. I think it is the most absolute rubbish I've ever heard. This is the current fashion in universities. It's patent nonsense, and I think it's nothing but a fashion. It's a way that intellectuals have of feeling like a clergy. I mean, there has to be something wrong.
Well, I actually agree with that comment. I mean, the idea that there would be a high cabal running things in a country like the United States is idiotic. That would say it is like the Soviet Union. It's totally different, which is precisely why I say the exact opposite. What I'm talking about, it's like saying the corporations try to maximize profit and market share. That's not a conspiracy. That's the institutional structure of the system. Individual decisions lead to that consequence of trying to maximize profit and market share. You don't do it, you're out of business. That's not a conspiracy, and it's not a high cabal. Now, why does Wolfe, or whoever it was, hear this as being a conspiracy? The point is that any analytic commentary on the institutional structure of the country is so threatening to the commissar class, they can't even hear the words.
Is he part of the commissar class, Tom Wolfe?
Yeah. I mean, he can't even hear the words. So if I say, There is no high cabal. What he hears is, there is a high cabal.
But don't you think the reason he can't hear the words is because he believes profoundly in the things he's been taught, that this is democracy, that there is freedom? It's like a lot of people like myself who used to be members of the Communist Party and who profoundly believed in the ideals and very painfully let go. Don't you think that there are a lot of honest people, Tom Wolfe being one of them, who profoundly believes in this, and he's not a member of the commissar class, he just has his ideals.
Yeah, but you see, what you're...
And you're threatening, you threaten those ideals.
But see, what you're describing in the Soviet Union is what I would call the commissar class. That is, the people who profoundly believed. I'm sure, you know, I don't know people...
Average people.
Average people,
Right.
but also all the way up to the editors of Pravda. If you did an in-depth analysis with them, how many of them would be total cynics?
Not many.
Yeah, that's right, because most of them completely believe. That's the way systems work. In fact, if you have, I mean, the way belief systems form, really, if you think about it, is, you know, we even know this from our personal lives. You sort of decide to do something for whatever reason, and then you create a system of beliefs that justifies it and says, yeah, I was right. Well, the end effect of this is that people who function within a system of power and authority, whether it's an editor of Pravda or an op-ed writer for the Times or a concentration camp guard or, you know, pick across the board, they're usually quite sincere about it. And they have worked up a system of beliefs which says, yes, this is just and right, and I'm completely free and independent. Yeah. If they couldn't have that system of beliefs, they couldn't continue. Now, the point is but I think when you point out that, I agree with you when you say it's a tight, closed system of beliefs. It's a kind of fundamentalism, which means you simply cannot hear critical analysis. And it's interesting to see what in the United States can't be heard. Ordinary institutional analysis, which says this is the way institutions function in a guided free market system given the distribution of power without any control, no control, you know, nobody's given orders and so on. This is the way it functions because of the way power is distributed. That's much too threatening to listen to, just as it's too threatening to hear the words the United States attacked South Vietnam or the United States orchestrated monstrous atrocities in Central America for the things. It's not allowed.
People get very emotional.
Because there are fundamentalist beliefs involved.
And yet,
can we talk about, we have only about 3 minutes left. East Timor and Cambodia. May I ask you to briefly make your case there?
Well, the case is pretty straightforward. It's as if history set up a controlled experiment. There were two major atrocities going on at the same time, same part of the world, roughly comparable in scale. One of them was an Indonesian invasion and annexation of another country, East Timor. The other was Pol Pot atrocities internal to Cambodia. The coverage was dramatically different. Coverage of East Timor declined sharply as the atrocities continued. The coverage of East Timor was pretty high before the Indonesian invasion. It then declined and hit zero in both the United States and Canada in 1970, and most of the Western world in 1978, when the atrocities really reached genocidal proportions. In Cambodia, on the other hand, there was huge publicity. Within a few weeks after the Khmer Rouge takeover, the New York Times was already denouncing genocide, when probably maybe a few hundred or 1,000 people had been killed. Well, what was the difference? The difference was, in one case, the United States was directly behind it. It was providing 90% of the arms. It was providing crucial diplomatic support.
The Indonesian invasion of East Timor.
The U.S. provided critical diplomatic support. Daniel Moynihan took pride in the fact that he prevented the UN from doing any action. He writes about it with great pride. The U.S. gave them new offers of arms. As the attack peaked, Carter sent more arms. In Cambodia, it was an enemy. You can be very moral about the atrocities committed by an enemy.
May I call your attention to, speaking of East Timor, less than 3 years ago, Amy Goodman and Alan Nairn, two reporters with whom you're familiar, Miss Goodman with Pacifica Radio, and NPR, a public listener-supported radio station, and Alan Cairn of The New Yorker, are beaten by troops who are firing on civilians around them as they assemble and march for one of the first. This is less than 3 years ago. Here is part of that report on radio. I want you to listen to this and comment on it. Just take a moment.
The Timorese, in an instant, were down. It was torn apart by the bullets. The street was covered with bodies, covered with blood, and the soldiers just kept on coming. They poured in, one rank after another. They leaped over the bodies of those who were down. They were aiming and shooting people in the back. I could see their limbs being torn, their bodies exploding. There was blood spurting out into the air, the pop of the bullets everywhere. and it was very organized, very systematic. The soldiers did not stop. They just kept on shooting until no one was left standing.
A group of soldiers grabbed my microphone and threw me to the ground, kicking and punching me. At that point, Alan threw himself on top of me, protecting me from further injury. The soldiers then used their rifle butts like baseball bats, beating Alan until they fractured his skull.
The point with only seconds left is, as is made in your documentary, this got coverage, but it wasn't much.
I don't think much, it was wrong, because let's look at what happened right after that, which has not been covered. The immediate consequence of that is that Western oil companies, following the lead of their governments, entered into agreements with Indonesia to rob Timorese oil. That's exactly as if Libya had entered into an agreement with Iraq to rob Kuwaiti oil after the Kuwaiti invasion. That reported?
So what determines what the Western media covers? We'll be back next time with Noam Chomsky.